And tonight's topic specifically, is your gut bacteria making you anxious and depressed? This is something I see all the time in my practice, so I want to share this information with you so you can see what you can do to feel better that may have been something you've never heard of before. Just a little bit of my background there. I'm a certified practitioner from the Institute of Functional Medicine, and I'm a UC Davis trained medical doctor. And I'm going to start with the story of a patient. This story is about Carol, who when she came to me to work with me in my program was suffering from depression and panic attacks that were really, really wrecking her life. Because of this, she had no energy, no motivation. It was affecting her career and her relationships, and really her life had been robbed of joy. She also had other issues like problems with abdominal pain and weight gain, and just really overall her quality of life was getting worse every year. She was having more and more symptoms. And after working with me in my program, all of these symptoms turned around. And the key for her was all about what's going on in the gut. And how were we able to turn that around? Well, I'm going to show you that at the end of tonight's talk. First, I want to begin with this quote by Hippocrates, who's one of my favorite guys because so many of his sayings are really so true. And this sums up the way I feel now about medicine and why I practice functional medicine, which I'm going to explain. And that is that the natural healing force within each of us is the greatest force in getting well. And it's all about harnessing that force. So I'm a functional medicine practitioner. What does that mean? It's not a very clear term, so I want to explain it. Functional medicine is really just a systems-based approach to medicine that is equipped to address the chronic health issues of our current situation here, not the acute infections that we had that were so devastating maybe 100 years ago, but actual chronic illness that just keeps getting bigger, like diabetes, heart disease, depression, so many things. What the founders of functional medicine realized is that to address this epidemic, we had to look at multiple factors contributing and not just looking at this idea of like, what is the one single cause? So functional medicine is a personalized systems-based approach. It uses advanced testing and it really utilizes an in-depth review of your story, your history, to piece together what are the contributing factors, what were the root causes of your symptoms. In functional medicine then really harnesses your own body's natural healing processes, because the truth is your body is always trying to heal. It utilizes nutrition and lifestyle interventions primarily to reverse your symptoms, and that includes targeted supplements as well. So key concepts in functional medicine are that chronic conditions have multiple causes, and this is something I really want you to grasp tonight, because I think our whole society is set up on finding like what's the single cause of, you name it, depression, for example, and what's the pill then that's going to fix that. But chronic symptoms always have their roots in multiple things. It's not just one issue. And there are common patterns that produce inflammation that are linked to these chronic conditions. And the microbiome is a key factor. And we're going to be talking about that a lot tonight. It includes the concept of individualized biochemistry based on your genetics and the key role of cellular energy production and how that actually impacts everything, including your immune system, and the role of detoxification, and also the environment. And by the environment, we don't just mean the air we breathe and the water we drink, but we also mean your relationships and your thoughts and your light exposure, so many things. So, I'm so lucky today that I get to work with people with this knowledge and this approach because it's so powerful and it's so different than what I used to do. It wasn't always this way, and it wasn't always so satisfying doing my work because I was a conventionally trained psychiatrist, and when I went to med school, I loved it. I loved understanding the body, learning how things work, wanting to understand what goes wrong and how we can fix it. But as my training progressed, and I got closer and closer to being finished with training, it really became about labeling somebody's symptoms as a diagnosis and then matching a pill to that. And maybe that wouldn't have bothered me if the pills resolved the root symptoms and didn't have all the side effects and worked really, really well. But At least in psychiatry, that is not the case. Many of our medications don't work very well at all, not much different than placebo, or they have really bad side effects. And also for many people, it's just very frustrating to think, so I'm going to take this pill now for the rest of my life, like something's fundamentally wrong with me, and it's not addressing the cause. So I was so fortunate that right around the time where I was getting more and more stuck in that approach and finding it frustrating, that I began to learn about the power of nutrition and lifestyle to change health, really transform health. And that was through some of my sister's health struggles. And as she introduced me to some literature on some of the research on nutritional approaches for a problem called polycystic ovarian syndrome, and I was blown away by this. I couldn't believe that I hadn't learned this information in medical school, this research that's out there for anybody to read about. And it just made so much sense. And I just kept reading, and I just dove deep into the world of nutrition and realized the power of this. And we had only 6 weeks of nutrition in medical school, and it really only addressed extremes of vitamin deficiencies. Like if you don't have any vitamin D, you get rickets, which is not something we really see even at all in our country these days. So it didn't address all these other aspects of nutrition and what happens when we eat, a standard American inflammatory diet, or what happens when we have moderate nutrient deficiencies, but we have a bunch of them and they last for years. What then? So this information was just transformative for me. And I began to hear these amazing stories of people reversing autoimmune symptoms with food changes. And I could not believe that I hadn't heard that. I mean, the options that I was trained in for autoimmune disease in medical school are really just steroids and chemotherapy, pretty serious stuff. And to think that one could change one's diet and potentially have a lot of healing was so hopeful. And it also made sense to me because the body really is supposed to be healthy. So what's going wrong? Well, as I learned this, I felt like I had to see if this could apply in my field of psychiatry. And I had to learn more. And I began to study with the Institute for Functional Medicine. And I began to meet psychiatrists doing this kind of work and seeing the changes that were possible. And that's when I knew I had to create my own practice to bring this information to you and to be able to work with people in this way. And it's been such a wonderful journey. And I get to keep learning all the time as more and more science comes out about what's possible, and to really help people in this very, very satisfying way of discovering what is at the root of the problem and addressing it and helping people heal so they can really thrive. And what's so great is maybe we're targeting their depression and anxiety, but so many other symptoms get better too. Their digestion, their skin, their energy. It's because the body's working better. So that's how I got to this point, and that's why I'm here tonight to share this information with you, because I just feel so strongly that there's so much you can be empowered to do to feel better. And you're going to learn some basic stuff tonight that you can start applying in your life. So here's another quote from my favorite guy: "All disease begins in the gut." And I think it may not be 100% true, but I think it's got a lot of truth to it. So let's start with an overview of how your gut works, because everything I'm going to talk about tonight will make more sense when you understand that. I'd like to start off with saying you're actually a donut. And what do I mean by this? Well, your gut, this tube that goes through your body, starting at your mouth, is really exposed to the outside world, just like the center of a donut. That's not the inside of the donut, right? That's the inner part that's exposed to the outside. And we need to think about our gut that way. There's an incredible job that the gut has, which is to bring in all the nutrients that you need and get rid of toxins as well as part of its job, but also to protect against any foreign invaders, anything that shouldn't be there. So it's pretty complicated. So I want to show you just an overview first. The gut begins in the head, and that's a really important concept. When I look for images of the gut, you'd be amazed. Most of them cut the head off, as if the gut starts right here in your esophagus. But no, your gut begins in your mouth, and digestion, which is, the main purpose of the gut, actually begins with your brain. When you look at the food, when you smell the food, and you anticipate eating it. And when you're cooking it, this even begins. And then, of course, chewing. And chewing is the beginning of breaking down the food. And the reason the brain is so involved is that's what triggers the release of digestive enzymes. First of all, of course, it causes the release of saliva. You notice sometimes you might experience some saliva in anticipation of something that you're smelling that you're going to eat. And it helps to stimulate the stomach acid that's needed in the stomach to break down the food further and to activate digestive enzymes. Then the food will travel down from the stomach into the small intestine, where more digestive enzymes will be released, and the food will be broken down into tiny particles so they can be absorbed by your gut. And if everything's working right, by the time it gets to the end of the small intestine here, you've absorbed the food you're going to absorb, you've broken it down, and now the leftover fiber is there for the bacteria to eat. And we're going to talk a lot more about the bacteria in a minute. And that's occurring in the large intestine. And the liver up here is producing bile, which gets squirted into the small intestine, which is critical for breaking down fats and helping you absorb them. And digestive enzymes are coming out of the pancreas, right there behind the stomach. And the lining of the intestine is really, really designed to have a maximum surface area so you can absorb all your nutrients. And so it's full of these ridges here that you can see. And then each of those ridges is covered with this thing that looks kind of like shag carpet, all these little villi, they're called, little fingers. And that's to have a huge surface area. And that's really important. Now there's many components of the intestine, and those are epithelial cells. Those are the lining cells. The smooth muscle, which is responsible for squeezing the gut and moving the food along. The neurons that control that smooth muscle, and the immune cells. And then that surface area, I told you it's so important that it's big. It's over 400 square feet. That's like bigger than a badminton court. And that's what it takes to get all your nutrients absorbed. That's just what's in one person. And as I said, that should be happening in the small intestine. Now, your immune system is housed in the gut as well as in other places in the body, but there's a large amount in your gut because it's policing that very thin lining of the gut to keep out pathogens and to be on guard to attack anything that it needs to attack before it spreads throughout the body. And the gut houses most of the human microbiome. 99% of that microbiome is in the large intestine. So what is this microbiome? Well, you may have heard about it. It's been in the news a lot over the years recently, as more and more research is showing the connection between these living organisms inside of us and our own body and our own health. You can Google just about any chronic symptom and gut bacteria, and you're going to find a paper that's showing a connection. Here's a variety of diseases that have been linked to the microbiome. And I mean, this is just a small sampling, but autoimmune disease, skin disorders, infertility and hormonal issues, psychiatric disorders, and of course, depression and anxieties we're talking about tonight, and also neurological problems like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's. So what is the microbiome? Well, in each one of us, it's about 100 trillion microbes. Now, just think for a second how big that number is. That's about 10 times the number of cells of our own body. So there's like way more of them than there are of us, so to speak. And it's found all over our body in every cavity. But again, the majority is in the large intestine. It's made up of bacteria and another similar thing called archaea and yeast and viruses. And in the past, we also usually had some sort of parasitic burden too, like protozoa or helminths, which are worms, which people don't like to think about, but it was something we were usually battling to some degree. So if you added up all the microbiome, it weighs about 2 to 3 pounds, and it's really like another organ in the body. And it's helpful to think about it that way when you start thinking about your health, because taking care of your microbiome is one of the keys to optimizing your health. Now, everybody's microbiome is different, and that is normal. There isn't one single species present in all of us here, or even if we were in a room of like 500 people, that would be the same in every single person. There's not one healthy microbiome. There's a variety of healthy microbiomes, and there's some keys that make it healthy. Everybody is different in their microbiome. Now, what is so fascinating about the microbiome is what it's doing for us and all the jobs that we have outsourced to those bacteria and other components of the microbiome. When the Human Genome Project started, we thought we would figure out how all these things happen in the body. And it was a big surprise to find out that we didn't have as many genes as we thought. And it turns out we have actually outsourced a lot of roles to the microbiome. And you can see that here, human genes, 23,000, but bacterial genes, there's 2 million. And so we rely on these. We co-evolved with the bacteria, and they do a lot of important jobs. And so they're really necessary. We need to make sure that we're having a healthy microbiome. How do we get our microbiome? Well, when we're born, we get it. When we are born through the birth canal, we pick up our mother's microflora, which is really actually even shifts right before birth, designed to give us a certain microbiome. And then through breastfeeding, it also promotes the beneficial bacteria to grow. And there's actually beneficial bacteria in the breast milk that's passed to the baby. And breast milk contains certain components that are designed just to feed the bacteria. Now, you can imagine then, if that's the case, that some things may shift a microbiome right from the get-go for some people. And these, of course, are unintended consequences. But if we're born via C-section, we don't get the same flora from their mom. And, studies have shown that babies end up with colonization in their gut of the bacteria from the hands of hospital workers. And that's not because they weren't practicing good hygiene. I mean, even with the gloves, this happens. And then also, if you need to have antibiotics at the time of birth, which can happen for a variety of reasons, that's going to really impact the microbiome that the baby receives from mom. Now, premature birth is another factor. I mentioned that when a mom is preparing for birth in the last few weeks, the microbiome is actually shifting. And I just find this a fascinating piece of evolution, that the microbiome needs to be somewhat different when the baby is born. And so a premature birth is going to result in a different array of bacteria. And then formula feeding doesn't contain the bacteria that we're trying to pass on to the baby, and also doesn't feed bacteria in the same way because it's made out of very different ingredients. Another factor is this idea of the old friends hypothesis, or the hygiene hypothesis, as it's been called. So the idea is we used to be much more in contact with the earth and with dirt, and we weren't super careful about hygiene. That was a foreign concept, in the past. And this meant we were in contact with all kinds of bacteria, and there was a benefit to this. There was also a cost, but the benefit was that it really taught our microbiome which things are, which bacteria are friends and not foes. And it gave us a sort of this is where we may have acquired certain parasites that were sort of helping balance our immune system, actually. And that now we are so clean in some ways that we have really depleted some of our exposure to bacteria. And this is more important when a person is growing up, really, this concept. And it's just as the theory that that's had an impact on our health. Now, the microbiome continues to get disrupted through different experiences in our life, like when we have to have antibiotics, and sometimes we absolutely do have to have antibiotics, but we do know also that they are overused, inappropriately used, for example, for a viral ear infection. An antibiotic works on bacteria, not on viruses. And so that's going to change the bacteria in a child, or also later in an adult. And then the foods we feed kids have a huge impact on how the bacteria grow and which bacteria are fostered. And, I put this in question mark, first foods, because, this is not what we evolved eating when we were young. And so this is quite different. This is a very sort of modern diet, and it has great impacts. And of course, the diet we eat after that. And I mean, this is the worst case scenario, but this is really what a lot of people are eating a lot of the time. And this is going to change which bacteria are flourishing in the gut. Is it the beneficial bacteria, or is it going to lead to overgrowth of bacteria that shouldn't be present in such large amounts? So the microbiome has a lot of jobs. I mentioned that we outsource a lot to them. And I mentioned that it does educate our immune system. It also impacts our gut leakiness, or intestinal permeability, which I'll explain more about. The microbiome produces all kinds of chemicals, including neuropeptides, neurotransmitters that interact with our own brains. and it modulates inflammation in the gut and the entire body, including in the brain. So this is something that I think was, I mean, this was fascinating to me when I first learned it. Now I can't imagine not thinking this way, but you know, in conventional medicine, everybody's quite separated in their silos, right? There's gastroenterology, there's neurology, there's cardiology, everything is separate. And we're not used to thinking about what's going on in the gut affecting our brain, but it does intimately. And we're going to see more about that now. So the microbiome, it helps break down nutrients and helps you absorb them, including amino acids, that's those AAs. Those are the building blocks of proteins in our body, critical vitamins, and essential fatty acids like omega-3s. Those bacteria, those beneficial bacteria, produce critical short chain fatty acids that our own cells of our gut need for fuel. And they release and liberate these antioxidants from these, for example, these blueberries here, which are rich in antioxidants, and these plant phenols. The microbiome helps us access those benefits. It produces, the bacteria produce all kinds of chemicals that are going to be interacting with our nervous system. And the beneficial bacteria are producing neurotransmitters and chemical mediators that are soothing and calming our nervous system. They're also producing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That is like growth hormone for your brain. That is critical for having healthy neurons like this neuron pictured here. It also can have a huge impact on our mitochondria in our cells. So our cells are packed with these little mitochondria pictured here, and they produce all the energy we need. And you know, without, for example, we know that without oxygen for 4 minutes, we die, and that's because the mitochondria need that oxygen to make the energy. So they're critical. And bad bacteria make toxins that are very harmful to the sensitive mitochondria. Bacteria produce chemicals that help us fall asleep, and having an imbalance in bacteria can lead to insomnia. I had a patient tell me once that when we were going over her history, she said, I used to have really bad dental pockets in my gums. And you know, it's funny, when I got them fixed, my insomnia went away. And I thought that makes a lot of sense from what we know about bacteria. So we use this term dysbiosis to describe imbalances in the gut. And you can have several kinds of dysbiosis. You can have overgrowth of normal, what's called commensal normal bacteria in the small intestine. So you're having normal bacteria, but they're in the wrong place. They should be in the large intestine, and they're overgrown up in the small intestine. You can have too many quote unquote bad bacteria. And I say in quotes because in the right amount, they're not really bad necessarily. But if they're overgrown, they do become harmful. And you can have overgrowth of yeast. You can lack a diversity of bacteria. This is one of the keys to a healthy biome, is having a huge variety of bacteria. And we know that with the diversity of food, we get a diversity of bacteria. And the healthiest microbiomes, when researchers go and look at hunter-gatherer tribes still eating their natural historic diet, they have a diversity of bacteria that's 1,000-fold more than our own most diverse microbiome in the first world. So we know that that diversity is really linked to, is what we were designed to have, and is really linked to health. A deficiency dysbiosis is lack of beneficial bacteria. So maybe not an overgrowth, but an undergrowth of something we really need, because again, they're producing very important chemicals and have a lot of jobs to do. So this term intestinal permeability, that's the scientific term for leaky gut, which you may have heard of. So here's how the cells of an intestine, the intestine should look. You see they're kind of tall and rectangular, and they're packed tightly together. Nothing can get through between them here. And they're locked together with these things called tight junctions. So these are healthy tight junctions. These cells are packed tightly next to each other like bricks with mortar. And so the things up here inside the gut, the food passing through, the bacteria living in there, toxins that are in there, cannot pass through into the bloodstream. And that is really, really important. They have to be passed through a cell by some sort of transporter, in other words, on purpose. However, if the intestinal permeability changes, then you get this opening of the tight junctions, and the bacterial particles and undigested proteins, like big proteins like gluten or casein from dairy, they can enter the bloodstream. And here you see things getting inside the bloodstream. That is bad news because our immune system is here looking for invaders, and it sees all these foreign particles coming in, and it mounts an attack. And it should attack them, but because it's getting triggered all the time, it's resulting in chronic immune activation, which equals chronic inflammation and all the side effects of that. So what causes this increased intestinal permeability? Well, those bacterial imbalances we talked about, dysbiosis, can cause that. And an infection with a parasite can cause that as well. Here's an example of a parasite. This is a picture of Giardia. And it's important to realize that these are not rare at all. I personally experienced this when I was trying to figure out why I was experiencing bloating and some other symptoms. It turned out that I had an infection with Blastocystis hominis, which is not uncommon. And I see that in a certain percentage of my patients. And I see these other infections as well. They can cause leaky gut. They impact the gut motility, or that squeezing that the gut does to move food along, and the squeezing that it does in between meals to clean itself out and keep bacteria down in the large intestine. So a parasite can really mess that up. And parasites are triggering the immune system and causing a host of systemic symptoms. Other causes of leaky gut include ibuprofen and other similar medications. The birth control pill can cause leaky gut, and a whole host of medications can. And here's that standard American diet again. It's very inflammatory. Many of these processed sugars and flours directly trigger the immune system. And the damaged omega-6 fats that you would have in, for example, the French fries, those are very triggering and cause leaky gut. And then blood sugar swings can cause it as well. And you get high blood sugar swings, of course, from eating highly refined processed carbohydrates. And stress. Stress is a big one. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about all the kinds of stress that I mean when I say stress. So we're used to thinking of maybe our to-do list as stress, or relational problems. Those are, psychological and emotional stressors. But there are physical stressors as well. And these all are seen the same by the body as stress. So illness or infection are stressors that can trigger leaky gut. Lack of sleep, even some things like lack of community and lack of touch, which unfortunately right now, both of those are really a big problem with our pandemic. And that stress, we're designed to be in community and to be in a tribe, really. And those things, when they're missing, are very stressful for us. Also, injury is a stressor. And sometimes people don't realize, but over-exercise can be a problem too. Exercise is obviously very important for health, but if you're overdoing it, not having enough time to recover, or you're dealing with a lot of other things like infection and toxins, then you may not have the ability to exercise as much without it being too much stress on the body. So stress has a lot of impacts. It impairs our immune function, and particularly the immune function in the gut. It decreases flow to the blood, decreases blood flow to the intestines, because you're in that fight or flight state instead of the rest and digest state, which I'll explain more about soon. And this is amazing, but the stress can actually change which bacteria really flourish in the gut, and it can alter the mix of bacteria present. And it's a cause of leaky gut. So when we get that leaky gut from any of these causes we just talked about, whether it's parasites or stress, standard American diet, usually it's a mix of multiple things, we get that chronic inflammation, and that causes all kinds of symptoms throughout the body. It affects all systems, including our brain. And it can have the additional impact of causing us to form antibodies that actually, the immune system's trying to attack those toxins that are entering the bloodstream, or those proteins or pieces of bacteria, like LPS, which is on gram-negative bacteria in the gut. That's a very inflammatory thing on bacteria. You form antibodies to that, but then those antibodies may cross-react with some of your own tissue and result in autoimmune disease. So leaky gut is really tightly tied to autoimmune disease when things get real bad. How do you know if you have leaky gut? Well, so many chronic symptoms are related. Skin rashes, headache, joint pain, bloating and gas, food sensitivities, especially increasing food sensitivities, like every month or two, there's new foods you can't tolerate. Brain fog, depression, anxiety, and just chronic inflammation, which is linked to just about every kind of chronic symptom or autoimmune disease. Leaky gut's an issue in any of these circumstances. So it's helpful to think of the gut as the second brain. And that's another thing that's been in the news. So I put some headlines here referring to that. How does it do that? Well, I've already mentioned how the bacteria are producing all kinds of chemicals, including neurotransmitters, and they produce inflammatory or anti-inflammatory signalers called cytokines, depending on which kind of bacteria it is. And these are entering the bloodstream and going up to the brain. And by the way, if you have a leaky gut, then you also have a leaky blood-brain barrier. The brain is not protected the way that we used to think if there's that increased permeability. So through the bloodstream is one of the ways that the gut communicates with the brain. There are two other components of the sort of superhighways that are part of the gut-brain axis or connection. And that is the lymphatic system, which is moving toxins away from the body, and also via the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is the cranial nerve, comes from the base of the brain or brain stem and innervates all of the gut. It's responsible for slowing your heart rate and slowing your breathing and responsible for gut motility. And so the brain is communicating with the gut through the vagus nerve, but the gut is also communicating back up to the brain via the vagus nerve. Chemicals can actually work their way up the nerve through chemotaxis, it's called, to the brain. This astounded me when I learned it because I'm not used to thinking of nerves as a chemical conduit like that, but they really are. And so you can see there's many, many ways that the brain and the gut are linked, and we keep learning more ways that they're connected. So here's an example that mice that were lacking a normal biome showed more risk-taking behaviors. They had higher cortisol, which is the stress hormone, and lower BDNF, which is that brain-derived neurotrophic factor or growth hormone for the nerves centrally. So they had all these impacts because their behavior was different, their hormones were different, their brains were different because of their microbiome. And if you gave the bacteria from a timid mouse to a risk-taking mouse, that risk-taking mouse would become timid, and vice versa. Switching the microbiome switched the behaviors. So that's all being mediated with the gut-brain connection. Now, we spoke earlier about the fight or flight nervous state, and I want to talk about that a little more. So officially, it's called the sympathetic nervous system, and that's the one that's activated when we have to run from a tiger or run for our lives. And that's a good thing. It saves our lives. We need it. But unfortunately, in our current society, a lot of people are walking around in fight or flight all the time. And that's not how it's supposed to be. Think about a zebra in Africa that is, just grazing, and then the lion shows up and it has to run for its life. And then once the lion has caught one of the zebras, all the rest of them just go back to eating. They're totally relaxed again, amazingly. They're not sitting there worrying about when the next time the lion's going to come by. And so they're able to shift in and out of that fight or flight state well. And we often lose that ability, and that causes a huge impact to our health. We want to be able to mount that sympathetic response and be in fight or flight when we need to, but then we need to shift back. When we're in the fight or flight state, it shunts the blood flow to our brain and our muscles to help us flee, and it really reduces the blood flow to our gut, because in that moment, digestion is not important. But think about what that means if it's always reduced. If the fight or flight is always on, when the blood flow is always reduced and the motility is always reduced, then we're really not digesting. So we need to shift into that rest and digest mode, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. That's how we re-trigger our gut motility to work well. And we can actually turn it on. This is why deep breathing is so useful as a relaxing tool. It is physiologically relaxing you because you're turning on that vagus nerve, you're triggering the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's why you actually feel better when you do it. So taking some deep breaths before you eat can really make a difference in your digestion. When you're chronically in fight or flight, everything's impacted with digestion. You're not producing stomach acid the way you normally would. And because of that, you're also not releasing enough digestive enzymes. Your gallbladder won't work well and squirt out all the bile you need to digest fats. You have low blood flow to the intestines and poor motility. And you don't have that important squeezing, cleansing wave of motility that keeps the bacteria in their place. That's when you get the bacteria creeping up into the small intestine and overgrowing. This causes all kinds of symptoms: bloating, GI discomfort or pain, heartburn, poor absorption of nutrients, which on its own then leads to a whole host of other problems, including depression and anxiety. And it leads to bacteria and yeast overgrowth, because also if you're not digesting that food, then it's right there for the bacteria to eat. They're supposed to be getting the fiber that's left over, but if you're not breaking down your food, they're getting that as well. And of course, this leads to leaky gut. So it's a vicious cycle. We know that anxiety and depression are both linked to high levels of inflammation, both systemic and in the intestine. They're both associated with low brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And remember, beneficial bacteria make that. And they're also linked to high levels of cortisol, indicating an overactive stress response. And that stress response partly could be triggered by the imbalances of bacteria in the gut, or a parasite infection, or toxins in the gut. And they're linked to increased leaky gut. So we see that it's tightly connected with what's going on in your gut. There's interesting studies that show that lack of breastfeeding as an infant was associated with a higher rate of depression, and that's directly connected to the lack or the decrease in the beneficial bacteria such as bifidobacter that we get through breastfeeding. And we know that bifidobacterium probiotic can be as effective as citalopram or Celexa, antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication, in one particular study. Here's an example of a study that showed giving a probiotic yogurt, which would contain lactobacilli and other beneficial bacteria, increased this finding on a functional MRI. And what they found was that they would show people faces of angry or frightened, pictures of angry or frightened faces when they were in the MRI, and they would read the brain's response on MRI. And people were much less reactive. They were calmer and more regulated when they were eating the probiotic. So it's changing our reactivity, our sensitivity. Here's another example of mice fed probiotics that had a reduced level of stress hormone and reduced depressive and anxious behaviors. And in humans, they've studied probiotics that have shown an increased focus on positive information. You know, when you're depressed, it's like you're looking at everything through a lens of everything being really negative and not able to really recognize some of the positive information. Well, that shifted with the probiotic use. And there was less anxiety when faced with a stressor and lower stress hormone. And we know from studies that Bifidobacterium infantis, which is one of those first bacteria we receive, calms the stress response in the body. So what can we do about all of this problem? How do we change this? I mean, it could be easy to think, well, I'm just stuck with this microbiome that I have after all my life experiences. But the good news is that's not true. There's a lot we can do. I've shown you how stress is so important, and managing stress is one of the first keys, because that's going to improve your digestion, which means you're going to improve your nutrient absorption, which will help your depression and anxiety, and it will impact what bacteria can grow and the gut motility that helps keep bacteria in the right place. And so stress is fundamental. Getting enough sleep is important. That's a big part of managing stress and a big part of helping reset our system. You can think about, when you're eating, about feeding your microbiome. What do you want to feed them? If you feed them the standard American diet and highly processed carbohydrates and damaged oils, that's going to result in pathogenic bacterial overgrowth. Whereas if you're feeding them healthy fiber, a variety of fibers, and a huge variety of plant colors, like eating the rainbow, that's a lot of different chemical compounds. And that diversity of chemical compounds will result in a diversity of bacteria growing. And you can reduce your exposure to toxins, so you're not killing off the bacteria that you want to have in your gut. The bottom line is, it really is all about what we eat as the biggest factor, because we are eating multiple times a day, and that is always having an impact. You can shift your microbiome within days by changing your diet. The goal is to eat whole, real food, which is what the beneficial bacteria are looking for. Again, a variety of colors, thinking in terms of eating the rainbow and eating them in their most unprocessed state. We want to avoid processed foods, especially acellular carbohydrates. That means really, really refined carbs and sugars, avoiding food additives. And this is important, artificial sweeteners. You know, when there was all this effort to reduce sugar, like with diet soda, it did not help stem the tide of obesity and diabetes. And that's because even though we cannot digest artificial sweeteners, the bacteria in our gut can. And those bacteria can become what we call obesogenic. So some bacteria will promote obesity. I told you about that mice study showing timid mice and risk-taking mice. Well, they've done studies like that with obese mice and skinny mice as well, where they switch the bacteria from the guts and the skinny mouse becomes obese and vice versa. So those gut microbes have a lot of impact on how much we extract energy from food and on how we store that energy, and therefore have an impact on weight gain. So artificial sweeteners are part of that problem and should be avoided. And we want our proteins to be clean, organic, ideally pasture raised in the case of red meat, and avoid antibiotics in meat, which are going to damage your microbiome. Whole foods, and increase your prebiotic intake. Prebiotic means food for bacteria. So that's vegetable fibers and those colorful polyphenols found in the rainbow of colors of vegetables and fruits. Now, a word about probiotics. This is Elie Mechnikov, who got the Nobel Prize for his work in recognizing the role of a probiotic kefir in the people in the Caucasus Mountains. And he noticed that they were living a long time, and he attributed that to their practice of eating and drinking this probiotic food. And that was really the beginning of that concept of understanding that these bacteria were having an impact on health. So here's just a picture of probiotic foods taken from my own refrigerator a couple years ago, actually. There's so many options available these days. And this is a wonderful way to be constantly sort of tending to the garden of the microbiome, inoculating it again and again with a little bit of beneficial bacteria, because these fermented foods contain lactobacilli that are very helpful. Now, there are some people who don't tolerate these because of histamine or other issues. So not everyone's going to feel good on fermented foods, but for most people, they can be a very healthy, good step to take. Examples of fermented foods include refrigerated sauerkraut. You don't want canned sauerkraut because that never had bacteria and nothing survives the canning process. And kimchi, kefir, and yogurt. And you want to make sure you're using yogurts without sugar and that contain live cultures. And now there's all kinds of fermented salsas and condiments. There's kombucha, and there's fermented vegetables like pickles. And here's an example of pickles, and this picture is kefir grains that they make kefir out of. And so that's a big sort of lump of bacteria there that are seeding the next batch. And here's some kimchi. So fermented foods are wonderful probiotics. They're inexpensive. They're what we've historically consumed. And if you look at traditional cultures around the world, most of them have some form of probiotic condiment that they do eat that has helped them. And I do like for people to understand that probiotics don't take up residence in the gut. I think people often think they're like seeding their gut with bacteria when they take probiotics, and that's not what happens. They pass through, so that's why you have to keep eating them. But they do a lot of good as they pass through. They're communicating with the other bacteria in your gut. They're communicating with your brain and your immune system because of all the chemicals they're producing. And so you want to take advantage of that. And the most common types of species you'll see in probiotics are lactobacilli and bifidobacteria. Here's another quote from Hippocrates: "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." And I think he was onto something. So I just want to wrap up by talking about my 5-step system for healing when I work with patients, and go back to the story of Carol and explain how she healed. So the first step is make the connections, and then uncover hidden causes, nourish and replenish, rebalance body systems, and retrain the brain. So first, making the connections. Well, that's part of what we're doing during this talk tonight. You're seeing how all the ways that stress and your diet is impacting your gut, and how your gut is impacting your brain, and how it's all connected. And when I work with people one-on-one, I create their functional medicine timeline, which is a document I use to see, oh, what happened when they were born? Oh, there was a C-section birth. Okay, that right there was altering their microbiome. And then there was a major stressor. And I map all this out, and I can start to see what may have been a triggering event, what was a mediating factor, what antecedents set the stage for what was to come. And then we uncover hidden causes, and this is primarily through testing. And here's an example of a part of a stool test that's showing a huge number of overgrown bacteria. You can see all these H's here indicating that they're high, and you see that we're way up at the top of the range. And this person has significant dysbiosis, which is causing significant symptoms. The next step is to nourish and replenish. When digestion has been impaired for a long time and the diet has been maybe not nutrient dense, not anti-inflammatory, there are a lot of nutrients missing, and the body can't work right without that. Remember, we're trying to harness the natural healing systems, and to do that, we got to give the body everything it needs. We rebalance body systems. This is learning how to get back into that parasympathetic state, right? And also balancing hormones, balancing the immune system, all the body systems that need to be in balance for healing to occur. And the last thing is retraining the brain. And this is really important because when we've had chronic symptoms for any length of time, our brain gets used to that and starts to think that it needs to live as if those symptoms are always going to happen. And that middle limbic part of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, they are scanning the environment all the time, looking for threats. And as you start to have more and more symptoms, your brain starts to think more things are a threat. So when we're healing and we're resolving the issues and rebalancing the body systems, we also need to get the brain caught up to the fact that now it doesn't have to react to everything. Because this part of the brain, this is an unconscious thing, by the way, this is really impacting your physiology and can trigger more and more symptoms and can trigger inflammation. So we don't want to leave the brain out of this healing. We want to harness the power of the brain to help heal the body, and we're harnessing the power of the body to heal the brain. And that synergy is what creates a really health transformation. So those are the 5 steps. And so with Carol's story, we found, with making the connections, there was issues with what diet she'd been eating. There was some factors of antibiotics when she was growing up that no doubt created some of her early gut symptoms. But then there was also a key factor that we discovered, which was when she had her gallbladder out, there had never been any effort to teach her what to do instead to support digestion. There usually isn't, unfortunately. And so she had worsening and worsening digestion as a result, and really was not absorbing the fat-soluble nutrients that she needed and the fats that she needed. And this contributed hugely to the onset of panic attacks and the worsening of depression. And that gut microbiome just kept getting more and more out of balance and causing weight gain and fatigue and a host of symptoms. So my job was to help her untangle all that. We found the imbalances on testing. We treated those. We helped her with her diet and helped her with the brain retraining and the calming of the fight or flight state. And all her symptoms went away. And it's so wonderful to see how much she's enjoying life now. She went and applied for a new job because she realized there was something else she would like to be doing. And she felt, empowered to do that and felt well enough to do that. Her fatigue is resolved. She's even lost weight. And this is what's possible when you address the root causes. So many things get improved, not just the depression and anxiety, because it's all connected. So I want to close there, and I want to just say that if this is sounding like the kind of journey you want to take and you want to partner with someone who can help you to uncover those root causes and teach you how to heal yourself, really, then I encourage you to take me up on the offer of a free discovery call with my staff. And when the person sounds like potentially someone that makes sense to work with, then my staff members will set you up with a wellness breakthrough session with me. And those are a really great opportunity for us to talk one-on-one about your personal story and what's going on. And I can give you my thoughts on what are the keys just from our conversation that I can see are going to be factors in helping you heal. And even this information, this half hour, can help people feel unstuck, which is so important. Often people have really lost hope because everything they've been trying through the conventional approaches isn't working, or they've got a lot of side effects and they are just feeling trapped. So I welcome you booking one of those. I would love to talk with you. And you can find the link for the discovery call. We're going to put that in the chat. And you just book that online with my staff, and they were very happy to talk with you. So what I'm going to do now is open it up for questions. Just going to stop the share here. All right, let me see. So there's a couple ways you can ask a question. You can actually raise your hand and I can call on you, and you can I'll make you able to speak and you can ask your question. And you can also type it in the chat. And also just note that in the chat, the link is right there for connecting to the discovery call. Don't worry that it says sales page there. There's nothing for sale on that page. It's just a call for a free call. Again, there's no obligation. It's complimentary. We really just want to help you learn what you can do next and see. And if it's a fit to work together, we'll talk about that too. Okay. So any questions that I can answer tonight? This is a great chance for me to at least give some general education. I can't give medical advice for your specific case, but I'm happy to talk about similar situations and what I can recommend. You can, oh, there also is a Q&A box where you can type a question. Let's see. Okay. Okay, waiting for those to come in. Okay, well, I'm getting a question about what are some of my favorite probiotics that aren't food. I get that question a lot. And, you know, it's tricky because there's a lot of different probiotics that can be healthy. People ask always like, do they have to be refrigerated? And what kind of count do they have to have? And it's not a one size fits all answer. In my practice, I use some very specific targeted probiotics that have antibacterial impacts. Like if I'm trying to help reduce an overgrowth of bacteria, there's certain probiotics I use, and I like soil-based probiotics for those, or bacillus species. And I also use a beneficial yeast called Saccharomyces boulardii quite a bit, which has a lot of power. So those are some that I use, but other probiotics can be very beneficial. You really sometimes have to experiment and see how you respond. And it's always a good idea with a probiotic to start slowly, because you can overdo it and end up with a lot of GI discomfort. You got to let your gut get adjusted. Okay. Great. Another question, how long does it take to heal the gut? This is a great question. You know, if you think about it, you didn't get to this spot overnight. And so it does take time. It takes a number of steps to really reverse years and years and years of imbalances, but it absolutely can be done. And I would say it's usually maybe around a 6 to 9 month process, depending on the degree of damage and imbalances. Usually people get some benefit very quickly within a few months, but there could be a stubborn parasite infection or other issues complicating the gut healing. Okay, we have another question. There's a question from Laura saying she's been diagnosed with polyarthritis and was told it's a precursor to rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. I'm sorry to hear that, Laura. She started an anti-inflammatory diet and have found great relief. Wonderful. But they're telling her that she will have damage to her joints that will never heal and always be painful if I do not get started on their medications. Oh. Do I feel that diet and supplementation can reverse all the inflammation? Well, that is a really good question. And I've had that question from patients before. So I don't believe you have to be on their medications. I cannot, of course, comment on your particular case, but in general with autoimmunity, it really depends on if you're stopping that damage to the joints. So if the inflammation is calmed enough and there's no autoimmune attack going on anymore, there's no further damage occurring. And in that case, it doesn't make sense to start medications that when there's not a problem anymore, because those medications are dampening or blunting or stopping certain aspects of the immune system. In fact, so far, I mean, they can really block so much of the immune system that they can have serious side effects. You see on the ads, like the risk of some biologic immune modulators can be leukemia, for example, or lymphoma. That's because your immune system has as part of its job looking for cancer. And if you're shutting that off, it's not doing that screening anymore. So there is a place and a time for those medications for some people, but I don't think that it means everybody with that diagnosis has to have medication. I don't believe that at all. Functional medicine doctors all over the country and the world help people all the time with autoimmune disease to calm the symptoms and to get much better without any medication. But it's a personal one-on-one decision. I mean, some people will have a very difficult autoimmune course and maybe need some medication, but doing the steps you're taking can reduce how much medication or how often they need it. And some people won't need it at all. Definitely don't feel that that is a universal thing that you have to have those medications. Yeah, I think the power of diet and supplementation of the right kind is enormous. And, let's not leave out stress in that situation. For autoimmunity and healing, stress management and reduction is enormous. And you can see why when you see the connections to the gut and the immune system. Great. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I love the opportunity to share this information with you because I feel really strongly about how powerful it is to help you. And this is stuff you can work on your own. You can eat a better diet. You can manage your stress. And I think that it is just so powerful, and it may not solve everything, but it can get you so far, and so much farther than doing nothing can, or just taking a medication. One more question just popped in. Can I recommend any books to read further about this? Yes, there's a lot of wonderful books, but a good one on tonight's topic is one called The Mind-Gut Connection, all about the bacteria and how it's connected. And yeah, sometimes I post about some interesting books. So look for that follow us on Instagram or Facebook, and we'll do a post soon about some additional books on the gut-brain connection and on healing through anti-inflammatory diet and stress management and the functional medicine approach. All right, thank you all so much for being here. I wish you a wonderful evening and a happy holiday.